Hey everybody, it's Kevin Carr, and today we're going to talk about how to progress somebody from a hip hinge to a kettlebell deadlift all the way to a trapbar deadlift. So I'm going to have Ariel help me here and do the demonstrations while I coach her up through these progressions. So first things first, when we're going to teach someone a deadlift, especially if they're someone who's brand new off the street, we just want them to understand a hip hinge pattern first before we put a weight down beneath them and before we start to throw a lot of load into them. So we're typically going to start a brand new client who doesn't have any injuries or mobility restrictions just with a chest loaded hip hinge. So you could use a sandbag, a medicine ball, or a light kettlebell or dumbbell like we're going to use here. So she's going to grab this 8 kilo kettlebell here. Just take a step back here, yep. And you're going to hold that up at the chest. Feet are going to be about shoulder width apart. And you know what I'm also going to have her do is actually just kick her shoes off. Because if you realize when we're teaching someone out a hip hinge, what we want them to learn how to do is posteriorly shift their weight. And if you look at the heel on any shoe, it's going to elevate their heel, and that's going to throw them forward. So it's just going to make our job harder. So have them take the shoes off. From the ground up, I'm going to cue them to externally rotate. So what I want them to think about is actively screwing their feet in the floor outwards. They're not going to move their feet. They're just going to actually externally rotate their hips and keep their feet screwed down. So the cue I'm going to use is try to screw the feet outwards in the floor, and that's going to help them to get their glutes going and get a little tension in their hips. She's going to hold that kettlebell tight to the chest. I want her to think about squeezing her lats tight here. And what I want her to do is just think about bowing. So the cue I use is imagine like you're trying to push your butt to the wall behind you. She's going to stick her butt back. I want to see a nice straight line from her head, thoracic spine, and her hips. We can do about 3 reps here. And again, the difference between a squat and a deadlift, I want to see most of the motion coming from the hips. She's going to have some slight knee bend. I don't want it to be a really stiff-legged deadlift. She should be able to get some knee bend there, but I want to see that she's folding at the hips while maintaining a nice straight line from her head all the way down to her butt. So maybe with a new client, this might be the only thing we do on the first 1 or 2 weeks so they can learn the pattern, because we have plenty of time to progress them forward and get to a deadlift. Quick note, if they're struggling still to get their hips behind them and they're kind of leaning forward, they're really straight-kneed, a really quick little hack to make things easier is you can just elevate their toes a little bit. So again, remember we took her shoes off so that she would be more flat on the ground. Sometimes you got to cheat it even a little further. So quick thing you can do is just elevate the toes. I got this nice little ramp here, but you could use like a 2.5 pound or a 5 pound plate, something like that. And we do a hip hinge that way. This can sometimes coach them a little bit easier to help them get their hips back. You're just kind of doing an assisted posterior weight shift with them by elevating their toes. So that's a quick little trick to kind of help improve their hip hinge if they're struggling to get into this position. Right? Now, but once they get that, we want to move on to teaching them the deadlift from the floor. And the kettlebell is going to be our go-to way to teach a deadlift. So we're going to get a bigger bell than this 8 kilo. I want to make sure they're usually using at least a 20 kilo, and that's for anybody. Even your grandma, whoever's in there, they can probably lift about 44 pounds. The reason being is it's going to demand that they actually create some tension in their hands and their shoulders to pick the bell up. I don't want to see them just kind of dangling it from their fingertips. That's a big pet peeve for me. So this is a 28 kilo. Ariel's going to get right over the top here. It's in between her feet, pretty much between her ankles. What I don't want is the bell to be out front. So if she took a step back, what you see a lot of people do is they set up with the bell out in front of them. And we just took all that time to try to teach her how to posterior weight shift by teaching her that hip hinge. We don't want to encourage a forward weight shift by getting the bell out front. So I want to see that that bell is lined up right in between the feet, right in between the ankles. Same setup from the hip hinge. We want to think from the ground up. She's going to screw those feet into the ground over the bell, create some tension in those hips. I want her to hip hinge down to the bell, right? I always say, just imagine like you're doing that hip hinge drill we were just working on. Now, really importantly, like I said, I don't want them to just dangle the bell on their fingers. So much about a deadlift is also creating tension in the upper back. So I'm going to have her think about, just like she had external rotation in the hips, get external rotation in the shoulders. The cue I use is to imagine, grip the bell tight. Imagine like you're going to break the handle in half. So you're going to actively bend those shoulders outwards, screwing these shoulders down and back, gripping the bell nice and tight. Now she's locked in place. She's nice and strong. Nice straight line from the head down to the butt. She's going to stand up tall. You see her nice and tall. She's not overextended at the top. Her abs are tight like she's in a plank. She's going to hinge back down, tap the bell to the ground, come right back up. Right? So all that motion is coming through the hips. Realize that on the way up, once that bell gets to her knees, it's all glutes. You see she's coming up, she's going to snap those hips under, but again, not overextending and sticking the belly out at the top. We want to make sure those ribs are down and that she's moving the bell with her hips, not with her lumbar spine. We want the majority of motion coming from the glutes because that's where she's going to be strongest, and those are the muscles that we're trying to develop. What we're gonna do with our clients is we're gonna progress them until we run out of kettlebells, right? And so for us at the gym, I think our biggest kettlebell is like a 60 kilo. So that's gonna equate to roughly 135 pounds. That means when they get in the trap bar, we know they're ready to go. We know they have the fundamental strength to do a trap bar deadlift correctly because they've lifted about that much weight with the kettlebell, where it's a little bit easier because the bell's right underneath their center of mass. Then we're gonna challenge them more by bringing the hands on the outside, and there's a higher loading potential on trap bar, so they have to pretty much earn their way up to getting here. So I'm just gonna wheel this over so it's a little bit easier for everybody to see. Now it just becomes a little more difficult because it's easier to hold here. She has to widen the hands out. And for Ariel, I'm actually gonna have her go on the low handles because she's pretty short. If you see there's a low handle and high handle setting, good general rule of thumb, if someone's like well over 6 foot, if they start to be like 6'2", 6'3", flip that trap bar up. For someone as short as Ariel, she's about 5 feet, we're gonna have her go on the low handle setting. Okay, she should be able to get to the ground there. So you just might have to adjust it. If you don't have a high handle trap bar, just pop it up on some blocks or some other plates so that it's more accessible for someone who might be a little bit taller. So now when she sets up here, feet are gonna be about the same distance, like when she was deadlifting with the kettlebell. Screw those feet in the ground, hinge down, grab it. Now, with those handles a little bit wider here, it's a little bit harder to set your shoulders. So what I'll say is imagine you're gonna twist and snap those handles outside of the bell, outside of the bar rather, squeeze those shoulders back, come up nice and tall, hinge, come down, tap. And you can see she's got a pretty good hip dominant deadlift. She's got a really big hinge going, right? And that's gonna fit her anthropometrics and her limb lengths a little bit better. It's important to realize not everybody's deadlift is gonna look exactly the same, because not everybody's built exactly the same. Some people have longer legs, some people have shorter legs, some people have longer torsos, some people have shorter torsos. Okay, so it might look a little bit more knee dominant or a little more hip dominant. I'm not that worried about that. They're gonna find the pattern that fits best for them. As long as they're maintaining a nice, relatively neutral spine, it's majority hip dominant, it might be a little bit more of a vertical torso, that's okay. People are gonna have variety in their pattern. This is just going to be a tool to develop lower body, specifically posterior chain strength and power. And so if there's a little bit of variety in how they hinge, I'm not going to be too worried about that. But then the trap bar is going to give us a lot of potential to get lots of load and get lots of load into the system for the athlete. So we want to progressively build our way up to that. Work on hip hinge, work on kettlebell deadlift, and then you can graduate your way all the way up to the trap bar. Thanks for watching.